Hello everyone and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Dan Hicks. Dr. Hicks is a professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford School of Archaeology, curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and author of the recently published book, The Brutish Museums, there we go, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, which is the subject of today's conversation. Dr. Hicks, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello there, Megan. Hi. Yeah, really nice to be here.
Oh, it is lovely to have you. So if you are on Twitter at all, you would have seen me retweeting this quite extensively because this is going to be an excellent conversation. I'm very excited. Dr. Hicks, could you please just briefly introduce yourself and tell us how you got into this field?
Sure, absolutely. So exactly as you said, I work at an anthropology museum, archaeology and anthropology museum at the University of Oxford, named after a 19th century archaeologist, Pitt Rivers, Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers. And I've been here 13 years as curator, but it's also a joint appointment. So I'm half the professor of contemporary archaeology. This is the sense that archaeology intersects with anthropology. Archaeology occurs in the present. That's at the heart of all of my, research over everything I've ever done, really. But I also find myself, not only outdoors in the field, but also indoors in the museum. And really over the past, especially the past 10 years or so, I've been, increasingly interested in how, as an archaeologist, I can understand the museum as a sort of an archaeological site, but also as a sort of ongoing entity that was formed out of empire, but is the sort of location in which we see something which is maybe more generally true, which is that empire continues, it endures, and indeed some of the modes of thought that were part of empire in the case of anthropology and archaeology, racial science, as it used to be called, various ways of organizing objects in order to tell a story about the world. Actually, those things endure and are made to endure in really certain very distinctive ways, within anthropology or world culture museums. So that's at the heart of everything I do. I'm operating really at the boundary in between archaeology and anthropology.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So your book, Brutish Museums, and if you haven't, audience, seen it, if you haven't read it yet, there'll be a little thing running across the bottom of the screen with a link to the book. We also have a 20% off coupon code. And for those watching after the fact, the link is also in the description. So definitely go and pick up a copy if you can. It's an absolutely fascinating read. But it looks at the weaponization of anthropological museums through the lens of the loot of stolen from the West African city of Benin by the British in 1897. So could you just give us a bit of background on what the objects are and exactly how the British came to have them in their possession?
Of course, yes, absolutely. So, this is a book that's really about the most iconic instance of, direct, looting of artwork from Africa, under the British, but also the British, the Anglo-German, the European, forms of ultra-violent, corporate colonialism as it emerged really after 1884, which is a key year. It was the year of the Berlin Congress. It was the year in which actually, this museum was, founded, but it was also the year in which the Maxim, the gun, which is at the heart of the book, the machine gun, was also invented. So there is this, what has in the past euphemistically been called the scramble for Africa, which makes it sound like it's some, Cub Scout, jaunt. Actually was incredibly, as I've learned in the writing of the book, was incredibly violent, involved a series of your so-called expeditions, which the Victorians, referred to as the little wars, but they were anything other than little. And one thing the book actually does is it encourages us to reframe, the period of time from 1884 up to 1914, the First World War, as a sort of World War Zero, in which international, military action of a very modern, character and a very ultra-violent, character was actually happening. And so among that, this incident, the Benin, attack in the, right at the end of the 19th century, in the Jubilee year of Victoria, in the February of 1897, this was an attack which was framed as what was called a punitive expedition. The sort of pretext was that there had been an attack on an earlier, expedition, supposedly non-violent or sort of unarmed, attempt, by English officers, English administrators to visit the Oba, the king of Benin, at a sacred, time of year. So this incident was sort of used as a pretext for major reprisal. This idea of the punitive expedition, of reprisals, really formed a very important part of how the British sought to frame, to really justify these acts of really regime change, of attempting to remove certain powerful figures. And so the Oba was at that time one of a line, royal line that reached back right the way into the 15th century. So actually a royal line that goes back earlier than Elizabeth I. And the palace, landscape was a sacred landscape of altars and shrines, which were there to remember and indeed to sort of commemorate the Obas and the royal lines and the royal power of the kingdom over the years. So this sort of sacred royal landscape and the power there was actually wanted to be removed for a number of years by the British, because it was in the way of developing the rubber industry, the industries around oil palm, and all various the importance for the British, for the corporate interests of the Royal Niger Company and others, of essentially what turned into the founding of Nigeria, as a British colony. But at this point, it wasn't a colony; it was a protectorate. It was a sort of liminal, informal empire, if you like, of some sort. And so in that context, this attack, but then in that landscape were all these amazing artworks, and these artworks that date back in some cases over 500 years, which are maybe the most recognizable, that people listening to this will imagine. But other objects made out of bronze and brass, also ivory, touch, just heard, over safety of objects. And I use it, the idea in the book is the idea of white projection, that idea of the switching of roles. And the really in these arguments, it starts with the idea that, of course, these objects have been safe for 500 years, and are then taken supposedly 100 years later. The argument is, well, we can't return them because they would be unsafe. But in fact, objects have been returned over the years, ever since the 1930s, and are entirely safe in the royal courts, in the museums in Nigeria, whereas the museums to which some of these objects were sold in the UK have themselves actually opened out these objects onto the open market. Some museums have entirely been shut down. Other museums have sold off some of these objects. So they haven't been safe in our museums in Europe either. There's also a sense that actually we don't know what there is in most of these museums. So the Savoir report, when it came out, published for the French 2 years ago now, made the important point that 90% of the sort of cultural heritage of Africa as a continent, is in Europe and America, is in the Northern Hemisphere. But I'd add to that in a UK context that under 1% of African objects here in the UK in our museums are actually on display. And in fact, we don't have full lists of, what there is. In a lot of cases, African objects are in a box that hasn't been opened for 100 years.
Since it was brought back.
So even the British Museum, who have more resources than most, aren't able to give us an exact number. There's about 900 objects that they have, which is maybe about 9%, 8% or 9% of the total objects that were taken at that moment. So they're certainly not all in the British Museum. They're in, as the book says, over 150, 160 or more museums around the world. But actually, how safe are things? How are we holding on to something for universal heritage when we don't even know what we have? And how come all of these universal museums are in the Northern Hemisphere? How come they're all in the UK, France, Germany, or the US? Why is there no if this is such a great idea, this hyper concentration of culture in a single location, how come it's all in in the north? So I think for those reasons, the argument, so actually 10 years ago there was a real I'm sorry, more like 20 years ago now, there was a real hardening of what in the past had been a far more really flexible position from a lot of museums who had overseen restitution. There was a hardening of the line by a small number of the richest and the most powerful institutions within 2002, and the book goes into this thing called the Declaration of the Value of Universal Museums. The argument for the hyper concentration of African and other objects from across the world in certain locations, the idea was, well, if you want to see your culture, you can just get on a plane.
You just go to the Louvre.
That's right. So it's easy. Whereas, of course, I mean, the changing visa regimes for Africans in the since in the past 20 years combined was already making that argument fairly shaky. But I think lockdown, as not maybe only something that's a short-term effect, which of course it has been, but we had to shut our museums, travel hasn't happened, but maybe it's made us aware that actually there is a coming crisis of the model of destination tourism, which is environmental change. So for all those reasons, whether it's simple fairness and the moral and ethical case, whether it's a practical case about how are Africans meant to get to see their own, heritage, because of the cost and the visa, regimes, or whether it's an environmental case that says it's an old model, it's a 20th century model to say, let's hyper concentrate these things. So in the Benin example and across Africa in a whole host of other ways, new museums which are imagined on a different form, on a more of an African basis, are being imagined, thought up and built. And certainly, as we saw in the announcement only, yesterday, the formal announcement of the next steps for the new museum in Nigeria, in Edo State, for the Benin bronzes. Actually this is an ongoing conversation in which the world is really changing. So we are now, me working in a museum as a museum curator, part of my job is on the one side to understand what is in the museum and to share that knowledge and to be transparent. And at the second time, it's to understand the value of those objects for people, today, which means listening to the communities and listening also to the demands, some of which are long-standing, for the return of African heritage.
So on that note, what are the best estimates for how many objects were taken from Benin?
So we're never going to have a catalogue raisonné for the Benin artworks that were taken. Such was the violence, the sheer, the millions of bullets, which I count up in the book, having gone through the records, the rocket tubes, the level of damage from these, weapons which were really, brought to bear alongside barbed wire and electric searchlights and so on. The sort of technology we associate more with actually the First World War, that is being really brought to bear against bows and arrows and 16th century cannon and a whole host of other different weapons. Such was the violence, such was the loss, that it's almost like the shattering of this material culture spread things out around the world. Certainly over 200 individuals who personally looted and actually loaded up carts or their own, put these things onto the battleships, that were involved, and then sort of took them home into the family home. Often some of these things are inherited across generations. Some were sold to museums. We're never going to get there. But the book really, for the first time, offers a first attempt, a provisional attempt to list all the institutions around the world and to estimate how many objects. So, at the moment, my estimate is over 160 museums around the world, 45 in the UK, 38 in America, USA, but also ranging from St. Petersburg to Australia to Abu Dhabi. And then maybe, absolutely certainly, if we remember we're talking about the bronze plaques as being more than 1,000, maybe 1,200, the bronze heads, the other bronze, images, sculptures, but then also all of the ivory work and the coral work and so on. My estimate is over 10,000 objects in total. Yeah.
And of that collection of 10,000, what is the state of restitution? So really, we're often told that there are legal provisions, and this is a legal. So this is a question for the lawyers. Let's hand it over to the lawyers. It'll be a very long sort of process. Actually, in many ways, as we saw with the return of the cockerel from, Cambridge, from a Cambridge a college actually last year, Jesus College. In a lot of cases, the decision to return for a lot of these non-state actors, non-state entities, is simply a decision of the trustee board, or in some cases the city councillors, and actually responding to their audiences, their local stakeholders. So the decision, we are at a really interesting point, I think, for restitution. The establishment this year in Nigeria of the Legacy Restoration Trust means that you now have in Edo State an entity which is able to oversee the creation of the new museum and is able to actually work to draw together all of the Nigerian actors, the royal court, the federal government, and of course, importantly, the national government, into actually, making restitution happen. And as we heard from the announcement of the governor only 48 hours ago, over the summer there was a further restoration from an individual, and he expects 4 or more restitutions to happen in the early year, in the early part of next year, 2021. So I think what we're going to see is that institutions who, and especially let's say North American institutions that have understood the restoration conversation and have sort of taken action on that in terms of First Nations, maybe European museums that have returned objects to Maori museums or to Aboriginal Australia. Art museums in which actually restitution in the context of Holocaust spoliation has been entirely business as normal for a long time. Institutions where the return of human remains has been just normal for 25 years. Restitution is already at the heart of our practice. So what I think we'll see is a logical, building on all that
expertise, all that really practice which has developed in the profession among curators, working with stakeholders, source communities. We're going to see that expanding and rolling out into African cultural heritage, and not only the well understood, documented examples of the Benin bronzes, but also I think across the continent of Africa in a whole host of other contexts. There are questions being asked now about why is this material not on the continent.
Mm-hmm. And they're excellent questions. Thank you. So a recurring feature in the book is the idea of the museum as a weapon in the fight for white supremacy and colonization. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the book goes into a little bit of the developments here at Pitt Rivers around the conversation of the museum's relationship with empire in the present. How do we as anthropologists and archaeologists find the public space that is represented by the museum for our discipline? How do we make it fit? How do we make it match up with actually where the discipline is now? Because the point of foundation, anthropology here at the Pitt Rivers was all about the idea of the evolution of culture, the idea that objects somehow might evolve in the same way as natural history does, and that by displaying objects from the global south and indeed from European, if you like, the deeper European past, the prehistory of Europe, that you might be able to create a story of which is a fairly classic Victorian improvement story, where object, you've got the Stone Age, you've got the Bronze Age, you've got the Iron Age. Right at the final bit of the Iron Age, in the Steel Age, you've got sort of Victorian Oxford, right at the pinnacle of cultural
human achievement,
development, and obviously civilization. So this is a period where, from the 1890s onwards into say the 1920s, there were some, whether it's in the eugenics field, whether it's in actually arguments about objects as well, some of the arguments, some of the intellectual debate was a sort of it was a debate that would lead into really arguments over which were absolutely things that we would not accept these days. A sort of proto-fascism, really, in some ways, about white supremacy, about the attempt to sort of co-opt the museum as a space that could celebrate, memorialize, and thereby make endure the violence, and also importantly justify or seek to justify the violence with which objects were being, and therefore cultures and all sorts of other things were being dispossessed from Africa and elsewhere in the world. So I think understanding just that layer of history that is only one tiny part of what the Pitt Rivers is. But for our audiences then in 2015 to 16 with the Rose Must Fall Oxford campaign, where African colleagues and scholars were, having really sharing what they had learned from the Rose Must Fall campaign in Cape Town, which was about the memorialization of colonial power at the heart of the academy and how important it was to dismantle, to repurpose, and to reimagine that. Here at the Pitt Rivers, there was the book tells the story of a particular tweet that was sent that said that the Pitt Rivers Museum is among the most violent spaces in Oxford. And for me as a curator, I hadn't seen it expressed that way before. That was a new way of pointing out not just that we need to somehow write these histories better some way, move the objects around, rewrite the labels, whatever. Actually, there was a sense that for some of our visitors, the very presence of these objects on display as not just trophies of war, not just like something that would be maybe you might see in the Roman period or something, but actually icons which were very specifically there in order to tell a story of, you know, racial supremacy and cultural supremacy, that they experience that as an act of violence. And then, of course, the realization that so many more people that would never even walk into the museum because of the fear of
Exactly, because of that, yeah.
So for us as the Pitt Rivers to, and indeed other, you know, museums, you know, like ours, to represent, to truly you know, to actually represent the communities that we claim to serve, and that includes African diasporic communities in the city of Oxford. It includes our international students. It includes our international audience as well. Really, we have to take seriously that this isn't just about, yet again, you know, rewriting the label, not just using these objects, you know, to retell history, but in some cases to where there are instances of the creation of essentially, you know, propaganda in, you know, material form. It's our job to be open to the idea of, you know, dismantling, you know, returning, and having a new kind of action-oriented, you know, conversation with those for whom these objects are so important and who care for them in such a different way to the conservator or the curator, you know, in a Western museum.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to underline, you know, just actually that argument about, you know, that we hear a lot about empty galleries, you know, or this is an attack upon museums. You know, this is so silly, because these are a small number of objects that we're talking about in terms of objects in our Western museums, and this is a case by case, you know, basis about the returning of objects when they're asked for. But it's also simply about understanding these objects and sharing that knowledge. That's what a curator does. That's our job.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it's so important that we're not hamstrung by these whataboutist arguments, by accusations of, you know, wokery or whatever it is. You know, actually this is an ongoing thing that anthropology museums have been doing for a long time in other contexts. We haven't addressed, you know, we as a field have avoided Africa in these conversations. We have often restituted to First Nations, you know, to indigenous communities in Australia and New Zealand, you know, Pacific. We haven't really addressed African demands, and it's high time.
Mm-hmm. Kind of related to that, also in the book you speak of transforming the purpose of museums from what you call warehouses of disaster towards recognizing them more as sites of conscience. Could you speak about what you see the future of museums as being?
Yeah, so I mean, let's imagine a museum where, a world culture museum where nothing is stolen, where there are no, you know, sort of, you know, displays of the human remains of black and brown people who were part of, you know, groups who suffered at the hands of, you know, European colonialism. But let's also recognize at the same time that we've probably never needed something like a World Culture Museum more, you know, than we do in this moment that we find ourselves in. You know, actually, you know, museum spaces where we're able to, you know, sort of, you celebrate outside of the conventional, you know, Eurocentric lens, creativity, art, culture, ways of seeing and knowing the world outside, which are from other perspectives. I mean, that's, you know, what anthropology is all about. But that has to be a human process. So it also means that it isn't just about, you know, calling up, like, you know, DHL to say, let's just send it all back, you know, as people might say, because the museum remains, these are, you know, sites of conscience. They are, as the book says, to some degree, you know, they are sites that have this direct link to colonial violence. And therefore we need to learn from, absolutely, yeah, truth and reconciliation in, say, you know, South Africa, but also learn about the memorialization and the coming together after violence that's happened in other colonial and former colonial, you know, contexts. So I think there is this role of institutions, you know, like the Pitt Rivers as something like a site of conscience, where they can be spaces for remembering loss and, you know, recognizing that, but also maybe, you know, seeing that we don't know how this ends. We don't know how the project of the Anthropology Museum ends. You know, I don't think it's easy to say that the logic here is that the pit rivers should be shut down. That isn't my position at all. I think we really need, what we need to do is to really, believe in anthropology as a, subject that needs to be absolutely transformed, but something like it is needed. So let's, use these spaces. Let's turn them into public spaces for not just having a dialogue about empire, but also really, taking action to think about, to remember, and to transform the world in terms of, the ongoing legacies of empire. We see in these museums something that is more generally true in the world, that the intellectual structures, the physical structures, the dispossession of Africa is ongoing. It was made to last, and therefore let's have those conversations in these institutions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. That was fascinating. We are going to take a very brief break, 60 seconds. So everybody, if you have questions for Dr. Hicks, please get them in now. I will not take new questions after the 60-second break. We have a few already, so we are going to be right back so Dr. Hicks can answer your questions. Stay tuned.
Okay, great.
If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we're back. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. So we're going to get to our audience questions now. First of all, Lucas Cater sent us $5. Thank you very much. And says, I've always wondered, in the case of something that was looted and resided for generations in private collection, how do you establish its provenance?
Sure, absolutely. That's a really important, issue. And it goes to the heart of really what a curator, does, when working with African collections. The book talks about moving that art historical idea of the social life of things, of the cultural biography of objects, into what the book calls the necrographic, the writing of the death histories of these objects, the way in which they were taken, the loss. And that loss, understanding that, and certainly action on, returns, has to begin with really detailed, actually often quite boring work over provenance, research. So the tools we have available to us are, like any other historian, primary archives. In the case of the Benin, bronzes, a lot of the objects that found their way onto the private market were in the Second Pit Rivers collection, for which there is a catalogue. Some of the dealers who bought these objects from soldiers actually published photographs of these things as a part of the attempt to sell them. So we can begin to trace them back to some of those. We've got auction catalogues, of course, as well. And then you also, so you can start from that side. You can start also from the paper trail that's there in the museums as well. So in the museums, of course, you have whenever they're acquired, there's some sense of the provenance. So then it's about trying to join those up. Obviously, in the case of the Benin objects, there continues to be a vibrant and important, tradition of the making of artworks, objects made out of bronze, that carries on and is sort of restarted in the early part of the 20th century. So understanding those later bronzes and the difference to the ones that were taken in 1897 is important. But no, I mean, this is at the heart of the kind of the sort of the forensic work which archaeologists and anthropologists undertake. I mean, often even just the physical object, it can have a number written on it. It can have, words written on it. So even just working with the physical form of the thing is something that can help you. But it's all about cross-referencing a whole set of, different sort of sources. And I think that's why it's so important that those in my position of relative privilege in terms of access to that esoteric knowledge, that actually we do that work and we share it, because it isn't something that is really, it's only something which one can really do if you're inside the institution.
Mm-hmm.
What's exciting now is that increasingly museum curators around the world who are responsible for the Benin and other African objects are really taking this sort of seriously. So there are all sorts of collegial, emails going back and forward, information being passed back and forward, because all of us want to understand objects in our care as best as we can, even those working in institutions where their leadership hasn't yet reached the point where they're ready to give things back.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Fidevs Melis Sin says, is there a capacity building and sharing scheme between the British Museums and African museums regarding the legacy restoration if objects are returned?
Sure. So that's a really important issue that we need to address. On the one side, absolutely, restitution, by which I mean the physical, not the digital, the permanent, as in not the loan, and the unconditional, return of objects that were taken is at the heart of restitution. But obviously, the reason for that is what happens next, and the reason, what goes along, with it. In the past, some museums have made the case that African societies and communities and nations are incapable of looking after their own heritage, and that's simply not right. It's sort of grounded on a whole series of not only neo-colonial ideas, but actually a sort of privileging of a particular Euro-American view of what a museum is. Mm-hmm. So when we give back Holocaust loot, we don't say that this should be displayed. We don't tell people they can't sell it. We don't take an interest because it was taken. It was wrong to take it, and therefore it is right to return it. When we return human remains, of course we don't expect them to be displayed or conserved. Often, or normally, they're destroyed because they are buried. Because that is how you respectfully deal with these objects. Now, when you're dealing with objects which are not just representative, but actually constitute the ancestors, these are royal and sacred artifacts. Actually, in many ways, what a lot of African communities would say is, well, this hard line you've got between human remains and sort of cultural objects, that's a Western way of seeing it, that's a European way of seeing it. But actually, in many ways, the meaning and the significance of what these objects are means something different. So why should we even expect these objects, to be on display? Why should we? In the case of Benin, there is this incredibly exciting initiative with the architect David Adjaye, and led really by the Legacy Restitution Trust, for which they're now fundraising. But the project is obviously going to happen, which is a new museum for really Benin. But that isn't any reason why bronze objects are unable to be returned at this moment. So capacity building can sometimes just sound like we expect African museums to be built on exactly the same basis as sort of European museums. And also there's a question of sort of resource there. I mean, the dispossession of African art is not unconnected from the dispossession of African resources of other kinds, and of the inequalities that were actively built in between Africa and Europe. So absolutely, I think there probably are debts to pay. There probably is a financial side to supporting African artists, to investing in culture, and to sharing knowledge of all kinds. But I don't think that while all those things are very important, it's very important that we resist that old argument that this means that the whole restitution, that we need to put off the return of objects until such time as, we Europeans deem that it's the appropriate moment, and we check the facilities. That's not what you do when you're the thief who needs to return, what you took.
Thank you. That same commenter goes on to say that she's working with community museums in Zimbabwe as part of a cultural heritage education program. And often local people have little say in the curation of their museums.
Well, that's absolutely right. But you can say the same, obviously, about the national museums in the UK, where I'm not sure that the communities of London have much to say in a democratic way about whether the V&A should be returning the Magdala loot, or what goes on at the Imperial War Museums. I think many of these museums are getting much better, but it's been our non-national museums and our university museums in the UK, local museum trusts, Birmingham, Manchester as a university museum, Exeter, Brighton, whole host, all the way from Ulster to Leeds to to St Andrews and Aberdeen. You've got a model in the UK for museums that really are in touch with their wider communities. So I think part of what we're going to be seeing for us on the European end of this, the supply side for restitution, where we find ourselves, our job, I think, is to have conversations with our immediate communities about these issues as well. I'd anticipate a very different nuance to conversations developing about African, objects, let's say in Leeds, as compared to Belfast, which would be based on the nature of the communities, the nature of the history of the objects in the care of the museums, and of course the world around them then changing. So we need to capacity build in the UK as well. And frankly, who are we to say that that we're so great when we don't know what we've got? We don't know. I mean, many of these non-national museums, they don't have a world cultures curator, never mind an African curator. They just don't have the expertise. The objects are locked up in boxes. We don't know what the state of the conservation is. So this morally high position that we've often taken is beginning to look pretty tired, I'd say.
Thank you. The Higher Evolutionary says, perhaps I missed it, but is there a larger Nigerian or African outcry that is bolstering this discord, or is it mostly academics? I ask as a person of Edo heritage in the US.
Sure. So absolutely. I mean, the question in many ways is, how many times does the Royal Court have to ask for the return of the Benin bronzes? There is no question of the position of the Oba, and there is no question, especially now with the establishment of the Legacy Restoration Trust. So absolutely, this is about listening to the demands of Nigerians and taking a case-by-case basis. What we're not doing at the Pit Rivers is taking all the objects from Nigeria, putting them all in a crate and sending them to Lagos, right? That's not the point. This is about the building, and it takes time, but it doesn't take that much time. It doesn't take a century, which is when the first request for the return of objects, when the British Museum oversaw the return of the coral crown to the Oba in 1938. That was the beginning of a very long process, which shouldn't have taken as long as it has. So the book goes into this in the detail, the detailed histories of what happened in the 1970s, all of these arguments. But no, absolutely, the reason to begin with the Bennett, this wider conversation about African restitution, is really to sort of address such an important a body of artwork and such a clear set of demands, from the Royal Court and from other, actors at the federal and national level.
Thank you. So this one is from Autobot Starscream. I'm not entirely sure you will be able to answer this because it's a little bit outside your field. But he says, how will this affect education of the world about the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite or Phoenician roots of the Bible and Abrahamic religions upon which the modern world is built?
So that is a difficult one to answer because it isn't my expertise. I mean, what I absolutely would say is that I'm not sure. I think this sort of knowledge, knowledge of the history of religion, knowledge of how if you like, traditional religion in Edo State and elsewhere in West Africa has developed its relationship to missionaries, but also it's the important role of West African civilizations long before the 19th century was in terms of shaping modes of thought and ways of being. These are arguments that need to be developed. This is intellectual work and research that needs to happen on the continent of Africa, as rather than it only all that knowledge sitting in Oxford or New York. So I think one way that I think research into the history of belief and religion will be absolutely helped by the process of restitution is to just foreground African voices, African modes of research, and of course that also involves the different ways in different locations in Africa, the different ways in which the museum itself as an institution is also being reimagined. So my voice here is, I think, important simply in terms of explaining what is in the museum I work in, what is in other European and American and other world culture museums, and to facilitate then the research and the knowledge that can be inspired by these objects to be made by Nigerians and others across the continent of Africa, based on these amazing objects that at the moment are in Oxford.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And we have one final question, and then we will finish up. Kafethe Mukestu, is there much effort to make replicas of items to prevent empty galleries as a sort of compromise?
So I'm not sure anti-racism and the dismantling of colonial infrastructure is something that we need to compromise on. And I also think that the argument about empty galleries is one that, simply as an expert in this field, I'd say it just isn't going to happen. I mean, most African, when 99% of these objects are not on display, we're going to have empty storerooms and therefore save a lot of money on the storage of these things. Never mind, and so that sort of under 1% that is on display, I don't feel nostalgic about that. I think, in some cases it may be loaned back for display. I mean, I don't imagine that every African claimant would simply want to display these objects in a single location, but that it's important. And indeed, there are some examples of conversations where simply signing over the ownership, is one
enough.
way. Well, in some cases, that is what people want. It's a case-by-case basis. This is diplomacy. But from the Europeans, the idea that we would 3D print these objects or whatever, I just think it's not what you wouldn't do that for any other stolen object. I also think that, where is African contemporary art in our art galleries? One thing that we could do is just rebalance, what's in the Tate, what's in other art galleries, even see art and culture. I mean, why is African art in the Pit Rivers all about things made, 150 years ago? I mean, there is a vibrant in Edo State. There is not, on the one side, the wonderful tradition of the making of the brass objects, by the guild, but also more generally, contemporary artists in Edo State, across Nigeria. I mean, Nigerian art, more generally African contemporary art is so wonderful in many ways and so inspiring and so great. Why do we not see the purchasing of African art more in our galleries, not as some one-off kind of tokenistic thing, but actually as part of our normal practice? So and actually where everyone's getting paid, that's at the heart of it, where this is purchased at the appropriate market rates. So how do you address that? The Pit Rivers is not, And maybe there should be some gaps in the Pit Rivers. Maybe there should be, because there were gaps made in African cultures. Maybe we need the space here, to think and to reflect. Also, if anyone's ever visited the Pit Rivers, it's famous for being, there are so many objects on display. It's so crammed full with things that actually the idea, you could never empty out everything from the Pit Rivers, because the 600,000 objects in our care, so many of them are already on display. So I just think let's foreground, let's not worry about the sort of colonial nostalgia, the idea that something bad will happen to the galleries in the West. We're well resourced. We're going to make sure that an institution like the Pit Rivers remains as sort of wonderful as it is, but also address the things that are not so wonderful about it, and making these institutions at the heart of it. Let's make our world culture institutions in the West fit for the 21st century. That's by actively returning, African art and culture when it's asked for, and by understanding what's in the collections, so those requests for returns can be made in full knowledge of what we hold.
Thank you. And I think that is a perfect place to stop. Thank you, Dr. Hicks, for coming on and for answering our questions. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, wonderful. It's been great. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, everybody watching, for your questions. Again, if you are interested in purchasing the book, there is a link in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. It is very detailed, but absolutely fantastic. And Dr. Hicks has a example for you, so you know what it looks like.
Yeah. Super.
Thank you again, everyone. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.